happened a month later. And that did not get anywhere near the publicity as the 250th of the Army. That may have slipped your mind. That is the 250th anniversary of the beginning of American chaplaincy. American chaplain services. Nobody knew that. That's why I'm here to talk to you about it today. So this whole topic, I'm going to educate you a little bit on some of the history of this whole area today. So I want to talk about that and this marvelous history that we're going to be going through today. So first of all, this concept of religious people interacting with military people and armies is not new. It goes way back into primitive history. Actually, thousands of years ago, the Assyrians of the first millennium BC had a whole cadre of what they called religious ritual experts, and they performed these various religious rituals to read and respond to what they perceived was divine signs. The whole culture was really a military religious culture. It was based on the belief that the gods demanded the empire be expanded through conquest. And that was the Assyrians, about 300 years of an empire. After that, I want to mention the Scottish chaplains emphasized the Druids. The Celtic Druids were their forerunners. These were high-ranking religious men who acted as priests and teachers and judges, and they offered wartime sacrifices before battles. Rumor has it, according to the Romans, there were some human sacrifices as part of that one too, but we'll leave our Celtic brothers and sisters alone for now on that one. And then there's this little book that few of you have heard of called the Bible. And the Bible has a long history of it. People don't know this. Did you know the oldest written history in the West is the Bible? I'm talking purely factual, leaving all religion beliefs out of it. 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, oldest written history in the West. So those books are ancient. The Torah goes back to about 1,400 years before Christ. So it's an old book. There's long Old Testament heritage, and if you know your Bible, you know there's a lot of connections in that. Deuteronomy 20:1-4 says, when you go out to battle against your enemies, do not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you. And then I know you've heard the story of Moses fighting the Amalekites. Do you remember this story? If you don't know your Bible passage, you know Moses, as long as he stood with his hands up, you remember this story? As long as he stood with his hands up in the air, the Israelites won the battle. This was in hours, but after a while his hands began to droop and they began to lose, so he called Aaron and somebody else over to hold his hands up so that they could continue to win the battle. And then of course we have Joshua 6. Remember the old Negro spiritual Joshua fit the battle of Jericho? Marched 7 times around the wall and blew the shofars, and the walls fell down. So none of those are called chaplains yet, of course, but it's clearly a heritage, a long heritage of religious people influencing military, okay? Now, the thing where it really changes is in the Roman Empire. This is where we begin to know what we now know as. If you remember, Rome was a state religion, right? Had many public gods. I won't go into it, but a lot of household gods and public gods. Pater familias were what the household gods were called. And there's all kinds of rituals and cults associated with them. The Roman emperor was a fascinating character. He was not just the emperor, but he was also the commander-in-chief, much like our president is today, but he's also the head of the religion, the head of the state religion at the time too, so there's no separation between church and state. He was what they called in Latin the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the empire. Now, this is especially important for the Roman army, which was the most significant institution of the Roman state. If you had an army behind you, you tended to do well politically, right? So armies had shrines, they had altars, pagan priests performed ritual sacrifices, and they read the auguries. Remember, they would look at, you ever seen those movies where they read the entrails of animals? Well, that's what they would do, the auguries of the gods, the omens. Generals presided over religious rites associated with various cults, different gods, and it seems the soldiers did take religion seriously too. They had their own connections to their own pater familias, the gods of their family around them. So, though there's not a lot of evidence, there may even have been a few what we call unit priests. but they were basically miles, the Latin word for soldier, who were acting as sacerdos, priests, basically soldiers doing that. However, a major event happened, and this turned many things around, and an old history teacher, we could talk about this for an hour, but this event changed a lot of Western history, the rise of this man, Constantine the Great. Major event happened in history, turned the history of the world around. October 312. Emperor Constantine was on the eve of a major battle. He was not emperor yet. He was on the eve of a major battle for control of the Roman Empire, and he was at a place called Milvian Bridge, a little north of modern Rome on the Tiber. According to many, many accounts, the night before the battle, he had a spiritual experience. He had a dream. And in his dream, he saw something. He was deeply touched. Now, in the sky, he saw the Chi-Rho, the cross in the sky. And you see the, if I can get my pointer, you see that right there? So he saw the Chi-Rho in the sky. And he recognized this is the sign of that cult of those who follow Christus. You know, he recognized that. So, well, this has got to be a sign, something valuable. So he had the sign painted on the shield of all of his soldiers. You can see that. So he had the shield, and and then he heard the words along with the cross. He heard these words, "In hoc signo vincit." And I know you're all brilliant Latin scholars, so you all know that that means in this sign you will conquer. And that's why he painted. And guess what happened? He won. Okay, when he won, the whole attitude of the Roman Empire towards Christianity changed. Of course, up to then, they had been badly persecuted, not continually, but off and on through the 300 years. And finally, the next year, 313, one of the great edicts, Edict of Milan, was passed by Constantine. Christianity now became, from the most persecuted, it became the religion of the empire. The Roman Empire, complete 180 degrees. This small, monotheistic, persecuted sect now becomes the religion of this previously polytheistic empire. And it grows incredibly fast. Estimates are hard, but a lot of historians would say, roughly speaking, one expert said, about 1,000 Christians in 40 AD, maybe 10 years after Jesus, 1,000, to nearly 33 million 300 years later. So in 300 years, talk about a rise, tremendously popular. Roman buildings are now given to Christians for churches. Fascinating story you could get into. They were called in Rome basilicas. Does that sound familiar? Yep. Basilicas were used for public gatherings and courts. We have big churches now that are called basilicas, so right from the old Roman history. The emperor begins to bankroll building projects. So that Roman money now goes to help support churches, and a lot of areas and buildings are just given to them blankly. By the 5th century, we begin to see the influence on the military. Christian priests are recorded as accompanying some Roman armies into battle to care for the men in spiritual battle, fighting in battle. So this begins a pattern of connection here. So that's the Roman Empire. Next significant figure, I'm a believer that history is made to a great extent by great people. Some modern historians wouldn't argue that, but I believe it is. Great people make great history, whether good or bad. Next great figure, this man. Have you heard of him? Yeah. Charlemagne, one of the great figures in Western civilization. 6th and the 9th century is the rise of what's called the Frankish Empire under Clovis, Pepin, and then Pepin's most famous son, Charles the Great. In other words, Charlemagnus, Charles the Great Charlemagne. He creates the largest empire since Rome, called the Holy Roman Empire. And he did it using military might and the powerful influence of the church. Okay? It's at this time, around the year 800 or so, we first hear the word chaplain. It's used to describe the Christian clergy who came along with the troops. And they were carrying the cloak of St. Martin of Tours. I don't know if you heard of this saint before. Fascinating story. St. Martin of Tours, here's his picture over here. Fascinating story. St. Martin of Tours was a soldier who was fighting with the Roman army, conscripted, He was a leader in the army, and he was a Christian. And he met along the road this beggar while he was riding his horse, and the beggar was freezing. It was very cold. And he saw this beggar and felt sorry, so he took his sword and cut his cape in half and gave half to the beggar. Okay, and then he went on his way. That night, he had a dream, and he saw the beggar again wearing the cloak. Because this time, the beggar was not the beggar, it was Jesus Christ. It's a way of saying he actually, by doing that, gave the cloak to Jesus himself. That cloak was kept and used and by the French army of the day, French armies of the day. And so the person who carried the cloak in Latin is called capa. The person who cared for the cloak, a priest, was called a capellanus. And when you translate that word, capellani, the French word becomes the English word chaplain. So that's where the word comes from, St. Martin of Tours. Now, what did the chaplains of the day not do? Well, fight. So even back then, there was this tradition that, according to Christian tradition, chaplains are not supposed to fight. Why? Well, what did Jesus say? Matthew 26, okay? Put away your sword. All who take the sword will die by the sword, okay? The 13th century great Catholic scholar Thomas Aquinas, if you part of Catholic background, you've certainly heard of him, is legendary theologian. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote a long history on chaplains, and he's the one who created the word non-combatant. So Thomas created that word. Now, knowing history, many exceptions occurred. As you probably know, given human nature, there's always different interpretations of that as well. For example, one funny interpretation, everybody knows what a mace is? You know, a long stick, metal stick. A lot of clerics would say, well, the Bible talks about put away your sword. It doesn't say anything about a mace. So they would carry a mace, and technically they're fulfilling Scripture. So pushing the boundary on that a little bit, okay? Some clerics did it anyway. In the feudal era, if you know the feudal ages, abbots and bishops would fight for the lands, and sometimes would die with swords in their hand. There's even a story of a saint, St. John of Capistrano, who led an army against the Ottoman Turks at the Battle of Belgrade. So a lot of exceptions to it as well. Just a sidebar, after the Civil War, chaplains are no longer permitted to carry weapons because of the Geneva Convention. Geneva Convention met for the first time in the middle of the Civil War. And they actually passed that guideline. Chaplains should be non-combatants in general. So that's kind of happened. Okay. Next slide. Let's kick over to our own. So we talked a little about history. Let us go into Middle Ages chaplains for just a minute here. What did they do? Well, they slowly become more fully developed in the role we know it today. And chaplain rituals kind of began. The most obvious one is confessing your sins, right? You confess your sins, what you do wrong. Now, we won't get into that, but again, if you know anything about Catholic theology, how we understand confession today has changed radically over the generations. So for Constantine, by the way, you know Constantine never got baptized till on his deathbed, which was very convenient if you were an emperor. You could do a lot of things. And a lot of people didn't make confession except once in their life, right towards the end of their life. So gradually in the Middle Ages, this began to change. And as people began to confess more often, you can confess and then go back out to battle again, right? So it's a different kind of energy on that, and it's a repeatable thing you can do. Going to Mass, receiving communion. Obviously, chaplains were Catholic until the 17th century after the Reformation. Then Protestant chaplains began coming in. Obviously, they don't celebrate the same liturgy that Catholics do. What's called viaticum, Latin word for via tecum. You give communion to people, even though it's not a Mass. You give them blessing, strength for the journey. Of course, you preach. Instruct, and preaching is also motivating, right? We'll talk more about that in a second. It's a way of motivating the troops for greater patriotic duty. We'll talk about Corby in a few minutes at Gettysburg, and is religious, but is also more patriotic as well, and encourage them to be brave and courageous in battle. And obviously, they offer special prayers as time goes by. Okay, and all this, as I said, reflects underlying Catholic culture, which would change, of course, after the Reformation. And this 8th to 13th century bishops get involved, no surprise. In the Catholic Church, sooner or later, the bishops and the Pope are going to get involved, and we're not going to go into it. But there's a whole bunch of guidelines here. Bishop's Handbook comes out. 2 popes get involved and offer guidelines. We won't go into it, but simply a way to say it got more formalized, right? Got more structured. People began writing about it and talking about it. So by the 18th century, all major Western nations had some form of chaplaincy. Everyone. Italy around 1587, France 1880, formally acknowledged in England in 1796. In fact, the famous Duke of Wellington, in his peninsular campaign, asked for more quality chaplains because what he had were not good. So he asked for better chaplains. Okay, let's kick it over to America, shall we? What happened in our own country? Let's talk about the early American experience of chaplains. Okay, origins are in the colonial days. Chaplains served with a whole bunch of New England expeditions that very few of us have ever heard about. Pequot War. Doug will give $20 to anybody who can explain what the Pequot War was, which I can't either, by the way, okay? King George's War. There were religious men with them as well. So by the time of the Revolutionary War, assigning pastors to military units had kind of become more customary. In 1758, Virginia, still technically a British colony, established a military chaplaincy at the request of one man, George Washington. We need a military chaplaincy. And then the big date, July 29, 1775, the Continental Congress officially recognizes chaplains and actually begins to, shocker, give them money. Actually even paid them. And that's the date that the American Chaplain Corps claims as its official date, July of 1775. In 1776, General George Washington issues the following command, quote, "The blessing and protection of heaven is at all times necessary, but especially in times of public distress and danger, a chaplain is allowed to every regiment to see that the men regularly attend divine worship." So this is George, who clearly wants this to happen. But Washington did not want chaplains to be just religious people. You got to stretch your perspective of chaplain. He wanted them to have a broader social, patriotic, morale purpose. So he intended them to visit the wounded, for example. If you couldn't write, if you were illiterate, the chaplain would write letters home for you or translate if needed, would give patriotic discourses even outside of church to stir people up, and would even be educators. And that role would continue actually right in through the Civil War. Chaplains were often thought of more as educators than religious people. So he intended the chaplain to be a key link between the commander and the troops. They were paid, curiously, and this will become significant, they're paid $20 a month, same amount that captains got. And that will be significant as we begin to define the rank of chaplains as we get into the Civil War. Very interesting statement, I'm not going to read it, by Washington at Valley Forge. So look at that, he directs divine service to be performed every Sunday. We are not to be inattentive to the highest duties of religion. Okay, so let's move on to the war specifically now, the Rev War. Revolutionary War, 218 chaplains, 25 were killed. That's 11.5%. That's the highest casualty rate ever in the American Chaplain Corps to this day. So the Rev War had more chaplains who died. The first official chaplain right there is John Hurt. Where is he? I think he's right there. John Hurt. He was a chaplain of the 6th Virginia during the American Revolution, and after the war, 1791, he becomes the first officially recognized military chaplain. He goes on to serve for 3 years. Now, most of the chaplains of that day were Congregationalists. America at the time was a Protestant country, okay? But the Chaplain Corps was fairly non-discriminatory. It would be open to people from other denominations as well. So through the support of General Benedict Arnold, there's a name from the past, his second wife was Catholic. He appointed a Catholic priest. Father Louis Lothbinier became the first Catholic chaplain to be connected to the Army of the United States. Unfortunately, not the first. He was not paid regularly. And after the war, it resulted in real hardships for him because he was actually a Frenchman trying to serve in the American Army as well. Now, War of 1812, 13 official regular Army chaplains serving the American troops, but many more served as state chaplains, militia, and this would be a theme as well. So that if you didn't have a chaplain, the states would say, well, a bunch of us are from this church, and I'll bet you we could get my pastor to be a chaplain, and that would happen very frequently in the War of 1812. Priests did care for soldiers at the Battle of New Orleans, because New Orleans is a very Catholic city, but only American War where there's no specific names of any Catholic priest chaplain served. Now, the Mexican-American War, this is where it gets really interesting. This is where the story of Catholic chaplains really gets interesting. It poses a challenge. America is what country? Protestant. Mexico is what? Catholic. Do you see a problem? It was. It became a huge issue. Many Irish, many German immigrants who were part of the army were Catholic. They were a very small minority. I mean, they were very heavily discriminated against. Not allowed to have services, not allowed to have any priest around, things like that. And they faced unique challenges fighting this Catholic Mexican army. They all felt discrimination. So this led to a very unique feature. I don't know if you ever heard about this before. It led to the formation of the Battalion de San Patricio. Have you heard of that before? Fascinating little piece of history. This is the story of 175 American Army deserters who actually joined the Mexican Army because of religious discrimination. Mostly were German and Irish immigrants, although some countries are in there as well. So that's a part of history most of us don't know. The Battalion of San Patricio. I'll simply say it didn't turn out too good for them. They were not well respected when the war ended. Many were hung. Some escaped. Some lived in Mexico after the war. But President Polk finally recognized, okay, we got a problem here. So finally on July 5th, 1846, he names 2 Catholic chaplains, first time. And wild guess, what religious order do you think they belong to? Jesuits. Jesuits are a constant theme in world history, and that's another whole talk I give on Jesuits. John McElroy and Anthony Ray, technically not still chaplains, but there was no officially military records about their careers. But we do know they accompanied the troops into battle. McElroy served a garrison. In the Civil War, we called them post chaplains, but Ray took part in battle. Ray was at the Battle of Monterey in September 1846, but also 4 months later, Anthony Ray acquires a dubious distinction. He becomes the first American chaplain to get killed, Catholic chaplain, to get killed. He is asked to go out. He feels the need to go out to minister to a Mexican village because they had no priest, which is a very gracious spiritual thing to do, not a very smart military thing, and he got pierced by lances by the Mexican soldiers and died. So after the war, 3 priests officially were appointed to serve the army in between the years. Okay, we're here because we love the Civil War, right? Okay, let's talk about the Civil War. Oops, did we get ahead of ourselves here? I went way ahead here. There we go. How did I get so far ahead? There we go, Civil War. Okay, this is our areas of interest. No surprise, as you all know, Civil War caught everybody by surprise. We all thought the war was going to be short and everything else. Same thing affected chaplains as well. Both sides appreciated the role of religious people, but there's unique issues surrounding both of them. Let's talk about the Confederacy first. They were organized a lot like the U.S. Army, but they had one exception: no provisions for chaplains, which is rather interesting, actually, ironic, because the preamble to the Confederate Constitution actually mentions God. The U.S. Constitution does not. The Declaration of Independence has 4 references to the divine being, but the Confederate Constitution clearly recommends, they say, quote, they were invoking the favor and the guidance of Almighty God. So in May of 61, Confederacy passed a law saying there shall be appointed by the president chaplains to serve the Army of the Confederate States during the existing war. They were to be appointed by the president and assigned by him to regiments as he deemed necessary. Now, it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to do something about it. Guess what the Confederates did not do? They did not do much about it, actually. It was never a big priority. They were far more focused on getting their army in the field and organizing their army, so appointing chaplains never became a priority. So what happened? Well, ministers began volunteering. You know, a bunch of if you read history, you know how it goes. Troops would volunteer in a company from a certain village, and the chaplain would be serving them, and he said, I'm going to come along with you. And so they kind of volunteered just to come along. Individual state units began looking for chaplains. You know, we need somebody. Well, we know this pastor back in Wisconsin, or back in Alabama, I should say, who will come and serve. And then sometimes the officers of the regiments would become active and looking. So gradually a pattern developed of regimental commanders, after they consulted their officers, would approve men who volunteered. Then they would send the commission to the Confederate office, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, on behalf of Jefferson Davis. So that's how they would get approved. But there's drawbacks. It's not a perfect process because there's no supervisory group. Union kind of had a rough supervisory group. Confederate had none. And here's a shocker, no church endorsement was required. No letter of theological training was required. So anybody could kind of volunteer and be a chaplain. So guess what happened? The people who served were not very well qualified. Some were simply believers. They entered as soldiers and later volunteered to serve as chaplains. And so in the Confederacy, if you read anything about chaplains, there's a lot more what they call fighting chaplains. That's because they started off as soldiers. And you can imagine how it went in camp. You know, their camp was, military life was 90% boredom, right? And 10% sheer terror. Well, they're sitting around in camp. Sunday comes around and say, boy, if I was back home in Huntsville, Alabama, we'd have service. Too bad we don't have somebody. And somebody said, well, I was a Baptist missionary in my church. I'll lead a service. If you do that enough, they name you chaplain. So that's kind of how it happened in the South, okay? An Army historian, John Brinsfield, who is the Army chaplain historian, estimates that there were about 1,300 Confederate chaplains who are known and commissioned. Only 58% were deacons, local preachers, or unordained people. So over half had no formal training, okay? And the pay was not as good as the Union as well, and they had no definition of duties or uniforms or rank. Okay, make sense? Switch to the North now. North had 85 years of precedent. Remember, we had chaplains since the Rev War, but the really informal, inconsistent routines. Oh yeah, Polk named a couple and there was some name, but nothing was strict, no more than no strict federal legislation. That changes in May of 1861. Abraham Lincoln gets involved, issues General Orders 15 and 16, which expanded the size of the chaplain corps. And he orders the colonels to appoint regimental chaplains to, quote, maintain the social happiness and the moral improvement of the troops. He said, well, we're looking for regular reports. So that's a nice thing I found when I was writing my book. There actually are some reports out by chaplains, not faithful always, but there are some reports out about some of the work they did. They were supposed to be elected by the field officers of the regiment, and they had to be regularly ordained ministers of some Christian denomination, different from the Confederacy. Now, does anybody see a little problem with what I just said in that document? Regularly ordained ministers of some Christian. So guess what happened? Our Jewish brothers and sisters, went to Lincoln and said, excuse me, Mr. Lincoln, we'd like to serve as well. And so they actually came in back in those days, as you know, you could actually get in to see the president. And they had a meeting and Lincoln changed it to, and he was a regularly ordained minister of some recognized denomination. And so there were 3 Jewish chaplains that did serve. And by the way, about 16 African-American chaplains as well, just FYI. None were Catholic, but they were about 16 as well. Now the official rank, uniform, daily duties, not clearly defined, but they received that captain's salary. Remember that captain's salary, that was linkage back to Rev War. They also got a horse if they wanted one. Government did not define them as chaplains though, or provide them uniform, rations, or forage. They had to find that on their own. You can see the standard uniform. I won't explain it. There's a good example of the standard uniform that was prescribed: a long frock coat, 9 buttons, things like this. This happens to be a priest from Notre Dame, Indiana, who decided to act it up a bit by adding epaulets and gold braid, which happened a lot, by the way. And then you can see the difference. Here's another Catholic chaplain. Look how he's dressed. So a lot of variety in how people dressed. There's a story I ran across about one Protestant chaplain dressed in bearskin, including a coonskin hat. So a lot of variety in that thing. So anyway, the government never really formalized their duties, but many unofficial chaplains would serve. In fact, in my book, I talk about 126, I'll get into in a second, Catholic chaplains. I estimate that 40% of them are completely unofficial. We'll talk more about that. They served for a while the troops were in the area. You know, the troops are marching through Emmitsburg. While the priest from Emmitsburg, a guy named starts with a B, Bellagio, I think his name is, he would come out and serve them. And then when they leave, he'd go back to his parish again. In the end, all these government orders, the long discussions that happened, accomplished one valuable thing. Civil War did one thing. Finally, the role, the status of chaplains in the United States military is firmly established. And it's been that way ever since. That's the history of chaplains, where it formally begins. Now, how many chaplains actually served in all? I put down the numbers here. You can see them. Roughly about 2,400 on the Union side, but less than 600 in service at one time. Remember, 3 places a chaplain could serve: regiments, by far the greatest majority; a post, meaning they serve Cincinnati, you know, when the troops go through Cincinnati, or a hospital. Okay, those are the 3 main posts. And the South had very incomplete records. As you probably know, a lot of Confederate records were destroyed after the war, but estimates are about 1308. John Brinfield suggests others go down around 938, but about 14% of eligible Southern clergy, which was a much smaller part of the country as well, and 41 died in the war. Remember we said about fighting chaplains? So that's certainly very true in the South as well. Now let's talk real quickly about chaplains. Oh, good, that merged over nice. And I've done a lot of research on chaplains for 20 years. Every single book I've ever read that mentions the word chaplain makes no distinction in chaplains. So for example, if I, as a priest, walked through a battlefield and said Mass for the troops 2 Sundays, they'd call me a chaplain. Then I'd disappear. Then you got a guy like Father Corby in the north, or Father Sheeran in the south, who served 3.5 years. They're called a chaplain. Do you see a difference? Very much. So in my book, I make a clear distinction between several distinctions that we need to make here, okay? First of all is official and unofficial. What is an official chaplain? Well, it makes sense. They're approved by some legitimate government authority. They got some piece of paper that says the government authorizes you to do what you did. And number 2, they've at least served 3 months. That's kind of the arbitrary term I used, because if you all know your history, 3 months was the original term of enlistment, wasn't it? So that's kind of the rough guideline I use. But that means many more were unofficial. I call them situational. Like I said, you're marching through a certain area. The minister says, man, I'm going to go out and see all these guys out there, and he'd minister, then go back to his parish again. Never formally approved, only limited service. And as I mentioned before, about 40% of the chaplains, Catholic, I identified were unofficial. The other distinction I make is full-time, part-time. Crucial distinction. Full-time means somehow you're formally inducted or mustered in. And that's what happened. Chaplains would get, if the process worked, especially in the North, they would get mustered in, formally speaking, by a state or a national government. And the number 2, I call full-time 3 years. That's a long time, because chaplains were older than almost all the troops, which would make sense. 3 years of uninterrupted, sustained service, which is tough because these guys were older and they were not used to this outdoor living, okay? And the other was obviously part-time. They had a day job, so to speak. They had a parish, they were teaching or something like that. They had their own people and they just visited the troops passing through. And I already mentioned the 3 areas, right, didn't I? Hospital chaplains, regimental, and post chaplains as well. Some specific points on chaplains: always a shortage. Always a shortage of chaplains in both armies. Never enough. In the South, every regiment should have had an active chaplain. That was what was stated. But in reality, it was reported in 1863, half of the Southern units were without a minister completely. And even the people you think would have them didn't have them. Stonewall. And if you all know Stonewall Jackson's history, extremely religious man. Married the daughters of 2 Presbyterian ministers, by the way. Okay, he only had chaplains in half of his 91 regiments. 44 of the 91 regiments. The other very religious Southerner there's a bunch of them, was Leonidas Polk. A very religious man, because he was a bishop, a pretty crappy military leader from what everybody would say. Polk had even less chaplains, only 13 of 40. In the North, too, in June of 62, of 676 regiments in the field, only 395, that's 58%, had chaplains, and among them 29 were absent or on detached service. Another 13 were absent without leave. Catholics, certainly true. Irish Catholic immigration had reached its peak. Remember the Irish potato famine, and immigrants were pouring into the country, and bishops were swamped. They couldn't even find priests for their there were no parishes. And they were trying to start churches, so there was even less that served 3%. Releasing priests was a difficulty. Quality of chaplains, just got to tell the truth. Early ones, not the best. Not the best chaplains. And they fought an uphill battle for recognition. One person said, Ambrose Bierce, who was a very caustic soldier, wrote after the war, chaplains did not enjoy good universal opinion in America in the 1860s. Okay, he said supposedly a chaplain, Bierce's definition, a chaplain is a man who undertakes the management of spiritual affairs as a method of bettering his temporal affairs. So you can see they were not very well thought of among many, and often they were seen as petty, conniving people out to get a little money. Some officers opposed chaplains. So we don't want those religious people that are going to weaken the men. We want strong and tough men. So some officers opposed it, you know. In both armies, there was a challenge to find good, capable chaplains. A lot of complaints about that from the soldiers. One Union officer said, a chaplain's post is one of the easiest to fill and one of the hardest to fill well. I'm going to try to move in. I gave you a lot of facts. I'm going to try to move into some stories now and people. So let me tell you a funny story. If you've heard me talk before about chaplains, I've told the story before, so please forgive me. It's one of my favorite. Jesuit chaplain, Joseph O'Hagan, served the Excelsior Brigade, 73rd New York. You may not have heard of them, but you've heard of their commander, Dan Sickles. Famous Sickles move at Gettysburg, of course. So O'Hagan was applying to be a chaplain. And like the regulations said, the officers were asked to vote. And here is what Sickles reported about the vote for chaplain. Over 400 voted for a Catholic priest. 154 voted for any kind of Protestant. 11 said, give me a Mormon. 335 said they could find their way to hell without the assistance of clergy. So that gives you a flavor of the mood of the time. And O'Hagan went on to be a very popular chaplain, by the way, and nearly all these guys did. And early in the war, there were some poor chaplains. Some used the position for personal gain. Some were too old, physically unfit. Some were simply misfits. And some had a lack of scruples. Story is told, I think James Robertson tells the story of one chaplain who, for the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, he went into a stud poker game with them, cleaned them out, and left. Obviously, they didn't have another chaplain again. One of my, another favorite story, and this one is actually told in the classic book, Christ in Camp, actually, by J. William Jones. It's a funny story about a Confederate who became a chaplain. Remember, Confederates didn't take care of their chaplains, and they didn't have horses. This chaplain is marching along. He thought that was very offensive. A chaplain shouldn't have to march. So he disappeared from his regiment for a day, came back riding a horse. So he pulls up right next to the commander of the regiment. He's very proud of riding his horse, and the commander says, "Where did you get that horse from?" He said, "Well, I borrowed it from a Virginia farmer down the road." And the commander got very mad at him and said, "You can't do that. These are our people, and they've got a farm. You need to take that horse back." So they get into an argument back and forth about keeping the horse or not. And finally, the chaplain says, "Sir, I want to tell you something. Jesus Christ, while he was on earth, took an ass to ride to Jerusalem." Well, the colonel was no dummy. He said, "Sir, you are not Jesus Christ. That is not an ass, and we're not on our way to Jerusalem. Take that back." So it's a good example of it. So anyway, as the first year or two went by, gradually the bad ones got weeded out. And generally speaking, by the end of the war, some resigned because of disappointment and difficulties, but generally by the end of the war, the ones who served had gained the respect of the troops in general. By the end of the war, there's generally speaking a positive attitude towards the overall role and influence of these religious professionals. By the way, in my book, I'll just pick a little sidebar. In my book here, I make the contention that Catholic chaplains were the elite vanguard of all Civil War chaplains. I got some pushback from the editors and somebody else, but I stand by it because I back up my argument. And I'm not saying they're better than anybody else. I'm simply saying they were in the forefront of the chaplains for several reasons. First of all, the length of service. Purely statistically, the Catholic chaplains served longer than the records of any other denominational chaplains, number one. Number two, seminary training was not even close. Catholics had so much seminary training, way above any other chaplains of the day. Very faithful service. All the chaplains, except one quirky guy, and I'll tell his story in a minute, all were outstanding moral characters, very strong promoters of faith. So I just want to throw that out. You'll see that in my book as well, too. Finally, I'll end with this. Who were the best chaplains? What did it take to be the best of chaplains? Well, if you're going to be a good chaplain, I go back to what E.F. Hutton used to say. We make money the old-fashioned way, we earn it. And that's what chaplain, you had to earn it. It wasn't, very rarely was it given. You had to earn respect on the battlefield. Three things won the respect of troops. Faithfulness. They did not neglect their duties. They were there every day. High moral standards. They preached. They prayed appropriate to the situation. They were faithful men there all the time. Number two, flexibility. One thing you had to have if you're a chaplain, you got to be flexible. You know, whatever it took to do, you know. You could be in the camp with soldiers, relate to them, play cards with them. A couple of people got in trouble because they played cards with the soldiers sometimes. They would be with the troops. They'd be out with the battlefield with them so they could adapt very well with them. And then lastly, courage. Probably the leading thing was courage. If you were out there on the battlefield, now soldiers, the chaplains didn't go in the front line, but they tended to stay back by the artillery or at the hospital tents. But as soon as the fighting was done, they would be on the field, taking care of the sick, pulling them off the field. Many, many stories. Several of them were wounded. I'll get into the story of one guy who got killed, one Catholic chaplain who got killed. But William Corby, in his great memoirs, there's two great stories, two great diaries of Catholic chaplains, if you're really interested. Corby wrote one, Memoirs of a Chaplain's Life, and James Sheeran wrote the other one. Corby says, quote, "Courage is the currency by which men's loyalty is purchased." And so the best chaplains, jacks of all trades. Whatever you need. Some chaplains would carry ammunition. Their troops would be out of ammunition. They'd run back and get ammunition. They'd carry the bedrolls of people. They'd write letters. They'd visit the hospital. So those people were the best of all doing what they could. Okay, make sense? All right, we're going to move on to give you some numbers here real quick here. Well, it's already up there now. Real quick here, I'm not going to spend time. 126 Catholic chaplains, 74 in the Union, 52 in the South. 76 were official. Remember I mentioned 3 years of service. 51 for the Union, 25 for the Confederate. 2 served on both sides. I'll tell you the story about one of them in a minute. Fascinating people. Only 15 were full-time. Remember, 3 years, only 15. That tells you something. Only 15 were full-time, 9 for the Union, 6 for the Confederates. Ethnicity, 80% were born outside of America. 80%. So the chaplain, there weren't many priests in America that were born in the country, so 80% were outside. Irish led the way with 37%. Guess which brigades had the most? Irish. And what's the big brigade out of New York? Irish Brigade. They certainly had the most chaplains. Chicago had a couple Irish brigades. Corcoran Legion was another one. Confederate didn't have brigades that were named a lot. They had one, the 10th Tennessee, which was called the Irish Brigade as well, and many other companies had them. 43 of the priests were religious orders, 83 were diocesan. Does that make sense? Okay, enough facts. Should I tell you about a few chaplains? Did I jump again? Boy, I'm doing this a lot here. Whoops, we went backwards. Okay, let's go up to a few stories of chaplains here. Come on, keep moving here. There's John Ireland, became renowned bishop after the war. And Darius Hubert, I was telling somebody who was about Navy, the guy who served in a little bit of the Confederate Navy was this guy here, okay? Where are we going here? Come on. There we go. We got to start off with this guy. Notre Dame, right? William Corby. If you've heard of any Catholic chaplain, this is the guy. William Corby, famed for his long-time service and for what he did at Gettysburg. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. Born in Michigan. He's a Detroit guy. 1833, only 19%. He went to Notre Dame at age 10. Notre Dame was not just a college then. It was a manual school. It was what we would call a grade school. They had a manual school, a school for seminarians, much broader academy. Ordained in 1860, he was soon put in charge of the manual labor school. And Father Sorin, who was the head of Notre Dame, saw great things in him. And he approved his request to be a chaplain 1861. Now, why is he so well known? Mainly because primarily, I didn't put a picture up here, but his diary, his memoir. If you want to read a great memoir, Corby's Memoirs of a Chaplain's Life is fascinating stories and lively. Stories of the Irish Brigade and things happening. He talked about this thing called a military mass. So if they had time and they were in camp and there was no battle pending, he would hold a military mass. That means literally all the officers would be required to attend in full dress uniform with soldiers. The troops would be out there. They would have cannons ready to fire at the point of the consecration. If you know Catholic Mass, when you hold up the host, the cannon would go off. Okay? By the way, I was a reenactor for about 8-9 years. I tried to do that at one reenactment down in Dollinger's Farm. I don't know if anybody's reenactors here. I was down at Dollinger Farm doing the reenactment, and myself and General Thomas had worked it out with one of the artillery squads to fire as I had the host up. He called nothing. Nothing. So I'm going out of the Mass, finally in the middle of the Our Father, boom, boom. Found out later on they were being very good reenactors. They were drunk. They'd been drinking too much that night, which was typical of Irish in the war as well. So his diary is fast. He had a great sense of humor too. He had a great line. Somebody asked, what do you do? What does a chaplain do? And he said, well, we do the same thing that parish priests do, except that we had no old women to bother us and no pew rent to collect. Oops, I got ahead of it again here, okay? He became well known because of the efforts of General St. Clair Mulholland, who was an officer in the Irish Brigade. He nominated him for the Medal of Honor. Only one problem. He had to be a soldier, technically, to get the Medal of Honor, and he couldn't get it. So guess what he got? Only statue to any chaplain on any Civil War battlefield, Corby. If you go to Gettysburg, you got to stop by Corby. You got to stop by Corby statue and see him on the rock, and I'm going to tell that story right now, on the rock where he stood. And a little funny story, by the way, there's two statues. One is at Gettysburg, one is at Notre Dame. And if you know anything about Notre Dame, Corby is modeled in the statues having his hand up there giving a blessing. Well, if you're a football player, and you know football, this gesture in football means fair catch. So we have touchdown Jesus, but we also have fair catch Corby. So you'll see him in front of Corby Hall today with his hand up in the air, fair catch Corby. So what's the famous incident? It was a general absolution he gave on the second day at Gettysburg as the Irish Brigade was about to enter the wheat field. If you remember your history, Battle of Seminary Ridge is going back and forth. About 4 p.m., the Confederate had broke through, and they said, we got to send the Irish Brigade in. We got to halt this massive advance of the Confederates. And they knew this was going to be deadly. They knew, because there was the Union line had broken, and the Irish Brigade was going to be sent in to halt them. So as they approached up the line, Corby goes up to the commander, Patrick Kelly, says, can I speak to the troops? And he gets up on the rock, speaks for several minutes, gives them a speech, puts a stole on his shoulders. Go fight for God, fight for the motherland, fight for Ireland, fight for America, fight for your faith as good Irishmen that you are. And then he gives them a general absolution, which means confession, but you don't have to say anything about your sins, just a general forgiveness. And then a lot of people say, well, that was really unique, it had never been done. No, it was done many times. Many Catholic priests gave general absolution. Corby did 3 or 4 times. But it was that day was tremendously dramatic because everybody knew it was going to happen. General Zook, who I believe came in at one of the brigades, after the battle said it was the most spiritual thing he'd ever seen in his life. Even the commander of the Corps, Winfield Scott Hancock, who was notorious for swearing and for his profanity, he was there. And if you see the pictures of him, see if we can find it here. There you see Hancock in the distance there. There you see him up there. Hancock took his hat off. It says something special is happening here. So this event became renowned in history. And then they went off into the wheat field, took 198 casualties out of 530 men. So a very definite battle. He was chaplain for 3 years of the 88th New York, only chaplain in the Army of the Potomac for a time in '63. Post-war president of Notre Dame. He did a good job the first time, thought he was free, and then it burned. So they said, Corby, come on back. And so he came president a second time. He was also head of the most unique Grand Army of the Republic post in the whole country. Notre Dame had a GAR post. Why? It was only clergy were allowed. Only clergy were allowed in the GAR post in Notre Dame, and Corby was president of that. He died in 1879. Let's go on to his opposite doppelganger on the southern side, this man, James Sheeran. I love this guy. He is funny and stands out for several reasons. Number one, he was chaplain for a long time, 3.5 years altogether. Very cantankerous personality. Great Civil War diary. Born in Ireland, immigrated. He was a married man. He married a woman named Margaret, we think. She died. He had 3 children. They all died in fairly short time. He was a school teacher, joined the Redemptorists, ordained in 1859, sent to New Orleans, and where he volunteered was named chaplain of what was then called the Polish Brigade, 14th Louisiana. That commander left, so it was no longer the Polish Brigade. He remained in the Army of Northern Virginia throughout the war. Fought in all the major battles, surrendered at Appomattox with only 27 original soldiers left. With all the battles, his denouement came at Cedar Creek, October 1864. He was taken prisoner by General Phil Sheridan in a case of mistaken identity. And this is a great story. Remember I mentioned the one Catholic chaplain that was a character? You want to take a wild guess what order he belonged to? A Jesuit. Joseph Bixio played chaplain on both sides deceptively. And a Union chaplain named Rizzo was actually sick. Okay, and he went into his tent, Bixio, and stole his ID. And then he portrayed Rizzo and went to generals and got 3 wagon loads of supplies. And then he drove them north into Staunton, Virginia, which was under Confederate control. Sheridan was furious. And so the very first Catholic priest he found, he took his wrath out. Guess who it was? Except it wasn't him. Sheridan got badly, he was sent to prison in Baltimore, and he almost died there before he finally got out, and he ended up going back to Richmond and surviving the war there. Very intelligent man, very well written, cantankerous, outspoken, one of the most fascinating Civil War chaplains. Great diary, just republished about 8 years ago, an unabridged version. Not religious at all. He offers opinions on everything under the sun, offers opinions on battles, of course from a Southern perspective, but just a fascinating soldier in his own life too. I'm running a little long, so I'm going to keep this moving here. Let's move on to another fascinating man in a fascinating place, Andersonville. Did you know there was Catholic chaplains at Andersonville? This is an amazing story here, one of the saddest stories of all. Father Peter Whalen, an Irishman, the oldest of all Catholic chaplains, 60 years old. How do you feel right now about going out when you're 60? That's what Whelan did. He was born in Ireland. He was ordained in 1931. He was only one of 11 priests. He worked around the area helping Confederate troops. And then all of a sudden, in May of 1864, another priest was riding through the countryside and stumbled into this place called Andersonville. He said, I'm going to poke my head in. He was shocked, utterly shocked. Couldn't believe what he saw. He stayed for 3 days, told the bishop, you need help. And he sent Whalen along. Whalen was over 60, stayed there 4 months in the summer. Incredible time. Sickness and death was the worst. He ate the same food as the prisoners. He says, he wrote down, I'm filled with sorrows for what I saw every day. He got a lung ailment that would eventually kill him a few years after the war. But before he left, he says, I got to do something for the troops. So he went out and borrowed $16,000 from a Confederate restaurant owner, a Catholic Confederate restaurant owner in Macon, and he took 10,000 pounds of wheat flour and had it baked into bread. And he drove the bread into the prison and gave it out to the prisoners. Many prisoners commented on that bread. It's called Whalen's bread. And it said they saved their life. Remembered after the war a long time. Prisoners never forgot him. They said his services were sought by all. In his kind, sympathizing way, the most despairing prisoners read that all humanity had not forsaken mankind. He died a few years after the war. His health grew worse and worse. Said he hung from the altar rather than stood by the altar. It was so tough. So that was Whalen. Here's another quirky story. Anybody been to Atlanta? Father Thomas O'Reilly. Here's a fascinating story. Another type of chaplain, not a regimental, but a post chaplain, another Irish immigrant. Studied over there, came to the United States. He survived the yellow fever epidemic before the war. Traveled all around the Georgia, ministering to troops. 1861, he becomes pastor of a little town called Terminus. You heard of that town? Terminus. Another name, Atlanta. Atlanta, Georgia. Eventually becomes a rail manufacturing hospital center, 10 hospitals, and that became his focus during the war. Now, when he was there, when the Union occupied it, he became friends with many Union troops who were Irish. They had some chaplains, but they started going to his church. So he got to know a lot of the Union Catholic troops. Why was that important? Well, in the fall of 1864, when Uncle Billy says, we're going out to the sea, we're going to burn Atlanta to the ground. This guy says, no, you're not. So he passed word to the general just below Sherman, and he said, if you try to burn this, my Irish parish parishioners will be out there with rifles to defend the church. And not only that, your own Union troops will defend this place, because if you burn the Catholic Church, that's excommunication. And so your own Irish troops, and you're facing a disaster and a mutiny on your behalf. Guess what happened? He gave in. And so those churches were preserved. 5 churches, plus the courthouse and the city hall was preserved. 3 of them are active to this day. You can go to Atlanta today and find a plaque and a statue for Thomas O'Reilly in front of his church today, Immaculate Conception Cathedral. Okay? All righty, and finally, one more priest before I get into some conclusions. This is my favorite. I'm working on a book of him right now, a biography, if I can get enough material. Father Jeremiah Tracy, why is he amazing? Chaplain for both sides. Another Irishman. Served in Nebraska territories for 10 years before the war, worked with Indian tribes, worked with soldiers, started a city. Can you believe it? He brought 60 Irish immigrants and a wagon train to Nebraska, started a city that is still there. Now, the city moved a few miles later, a few miles down the road, but it's still there to this day. 1860, he got sick. He went south to Alabama, became pastor at Huntsville, Alabama, which was great. Started building a church until 1861 came along. And then he started working with the Confederate troops at Forts Morgan and Gaines down there, Forts Morgan and Jones, excuse me. Then after Fort Donelson, he gets medical supplies for the Confederate Army. He helps organize a hospital for them. But he's going back and forth. And on one of his trips back and forth, he gets captured by the Union. Now, I won't go into it. I tell the story in my book. He actually gets captured, and released again. Well, the last time he gets captured, he's in big trouble because he runs across a Union sergeant who's not a Catholic, not a believer at all, and he's ready to about shoot this guy. And he's in big trouble. All of a sudden walks in the tent General David Stanley. And all of a sudden he said, well, who are you? And they start talking. He becomes best buddies. He says, come on, stay, let him go. I'm going to take care of my tent tonight. So they strike up a friendship. And then he sends a command to his officer, William Rosecrans. Why is that significant? Highest ranking Catholic officer in the Union Army is William Rosecrans. Rosecrans said, you got a priest? Send him to me. So now he becomes Rosecrans' chaplain for the rest of the war. Amazing chaplain, amazing man, brave, cantankerous. One deserter, a Union deserter, was captured fighting for the Confederacy. They were going to shoot him, and they said, you want a chaplain? And he says, quote, if I were to have any, I said, I don't want any preacher. He said, if I was going to see any preacher, it'd be that damn old man Tracy. He's the damnedest sensible one among them. So Tracy went to him, spent the whole night with him. Guy broke down in tears, made a confession, was baptized. Next day he came out, he apologized, forgave all the people who brought him in, he was shot. So just one of those poignant stories that goes on. A very courageous man. After the war, he traveled a lot raising money. A lot of the parishes in the South were devastated. He raised funds to help keep them going. So there's a few of the stories. Let me begin to wrap up by some consequences. What's some of the consequences of all this story? Number one, United States in the Civil War was a republic of suffering. If you've read Drew Galpin Foss's book of that name, Republic of Suffering, is a beautifully done book about the role of suffering. We traditionally say, 623,000 died. Modern estimates are kicking it up even higher to over 700,000. So it's a lot of numbers. I won't go into the details, but we know that for every 3 soldiers that died in battle, 5 died of sickness, right? Did you know in the Civil War, more Civil War soldiers died in prison camps than all our American losses in Vietnam? So Catholic priests were subject to this as well. One priest died in battle. Father Emmerin Blimel was killed as he was bending down. The Confederate 10th Tennessee was anointing his commanding officer, got hit by a solid shot and was killed. 8 other priests died of sickness during the war. Only 14 served 3 whole years, okay? 2/3 of them had careers cut short because of sickness. So sickness affected chaplains as well. Only a handful made it through the war without some health problems. Number 2 was overcoming bias. Catholics had a lot of bias in the Civil War era. It had been existed in America since the beginning of the country, and some priests felt a lot of resistance. Some were not allowed to minister because the commanders did not want a Catholic priest among their troops. Some priests pushed right back. Father Sheeran, who was cantankerous, would push right back, actually. Father Gachet, another Confederate chaplain, I got to tell you this funny story. Gachet was a strong, ultra-conservative Catholic, and he was a hospital chaplain. Well, one day in his hospital, a Protestant chaplain walked in and said, I'm going to get all these Catholics and convert them and become Protestants. So he started holding his services, trying to compete with Gachet. Well, Gaucher was ticked off, so he and the refectorian was in charge of the dining hall and the meals. He was a Catholic. So they cooked up a scheme where as soon as the Protestant minister started preaching, the refectorian rang the dinner bell. And everybody ran out of his church service and went to eat dinner. So he did this repeatedly, and finally the chaplain gave up. So some of these priests were feisty on their own. Prejudice in America didn't disappear because of the war, but it clearly helped thaw the ice in a lot of ways. My last point, why I wrote this book, why I give these presentations, believe in belief, folks. Believe in the power of belief throughout history to change history. Today, our world is a very postmodern place, right? Very postmodern, not particularly religious. Skepticism reigns, relativism reigns about values and grand narratives and spiritual worldviews. And a lot of people say, well, it's not that important today. It wasn't important then. Wrong. 19th century, very different place. Very different place. Religion and faith in the 19th century were probably the most dominant social factor in the country. They influenced soldiers deeply and influenced the country deeply. They're the most profound, meaningful realities, literally, of life. And as always, chaplains are the ones that are needed to be its messengers and to be its motivators. So believe in belief, folks. Like George Marsden says, quote, American history recounted without its religious history is like telling the story of Moby Dick and leaving out the whale. Two closing sayings. James McPherson, who I was very blessed, wrote forwards for both of my books. He really appreciates the role of religion. He says, Civil War armies were arguably the most religious armies in American history. A lot of people say by the end of the war, about half of the troops took religion seriously. Were they in church all the time? No. But they honored the role and the value of religion. And lastly, a quote connected to one Southern chaplain, Father Jean-Baptiste Moten, who was, by the way, a prominent architect, whose buildings in Mississippi are on the national heritage of Mississippi right now, his architectural designs. He died in the yellow fever epidemic in 1878. His quote, the quote on his grave, sums up this whole talk well. It's simply a quote from the good book, John chapter 10, the good shepherd gives his life for his sheep. Thank you so much for listening.